Welcome back. Before we begin, picture this. It is a cold morning in a shallow valley in what will one day be called northern England, and a young woman crouches at the edge of a still lake, breaking the thin skin of ice with the back of her hand. Smoke drifts from a cluster of low timber shelters behind her. Somewhere nearby, a dog, one of the first dogs any human has ever kept, barks once and falls silent. She has no name for the year she is living in. She does not know that roughly 12,000 years from this exact morning, people will dig up the ground beneath her feet and be astonished that she was ever here at all. Using AI-assisted reconstructions, historical illustration, and real archaeological evidence pulled directly from the earth she is standing on, we are going to walk through 7 representative days of a life like hers, moment by moment, meal by meal, decision by decision. And by the end of this journey, you will see, in full daylight, exactly what this place looks like today. To understand her world, we have to go back further still, to a colder and quieter version of this landscape. Long before any lakeside settlement existed, small bands of hunter-gatherers moved through this region, following herds of reindeer and wild horses across a landscape recovering from an ice age. There were no permanent homes yet, only temporary camps, worn hide tents, and hearths that lasted a season before being abandoned. The people who eventually settled beside this particular lake, a place archaeologists now call Star Carr, arrived sometime around 11,500 years ago, when melting glaciers had left behind a patchwork of forests, wetlands, and open water across what is now Yorkshire. They came for one overwhelming reason: resources. The lake teemed with fish, the reed beds sheltered waterfowl, and the surrounding birch and pine woodland was thick with red deer, elk, and wild boar. Nobody living there in those early seasons could have imagined that their modest camp of wooden platforms and brushwood shelters would one day be recognized as one of the most important windows into early human life ever found in Europe. By what we might call day 1 of our 7, the settlement had grown into something more deliberate. Wooden platforms, built from split timber and laid directly over the marshy lake edge, extended the usable ground of the camp out over the water itself, some of the earliest carpentry evidence found anywhere on the continent. The central structure, roughly 3.5 meters across, used a ring of wooden posts to support a roof of turf, bark, and animal hide, built to be warm through brutal winters and cool enough to be tolerable in short, intense summers. Nothing about this camp was static. Post holes excavated from the site show structures rebuilt, shifted, and repaired again and again, evidence that this was not a single settlement frozen in time but a living space, used and altered across many generations. The people here were not passively surviving. They were engineering their environment, laying down brushwood trackways to stop themselves from sinking into the peat, driving wooden stakes to anchor platforms against the shifting shoreline, adjusting and rebuilding as the water level itself rose and fell with the seasons. Spiritual and communal life at Star Carr did not look like a temple or a courtroom, but it was no less real. Among the most extraordinary objects recovered from the site are more than 20 headdresses made from the skulls of red deer, the antlers still attached, the bone carefully thinned and fitted with holes, likely for straps or cords. Many archaeologists believe these were worn during rituals, perhaps to invoke the spirit of the deer before a hunt, perhaps as part of ceremonies marking status, transformation, or connection to the animal world that sustained the entire community. Alongside them, engraved amber pendants and beads of shale suggest people who valued adornment, symbolism, and shared meaning just as deeply as any later, more architecturally elaborate civilization. Different layers of activity at the site, some built directly atop older, collapsed structures, show generation after generation returning to the same sacred and practical ground, layering their own lives over the memory of those who came before. Ordinary life at the lake was loud in its own quiet way. Children's voices, the crack of flint being napped into blades and scrapers, the rhythmic thud of wood being split for the platforms, the constant low conversation of a group who depended entirely on cooperation to survive. Estimates suggest the camp may have supported anywhere from a handful of families to several dozen people at any one time, moving seasonally rather than staying in one fixed number year-round. Diets were varied and surprisingly rich. Red deer and roe deer, wild boar, elk, a wide range of fish and waterfowl, hazelnuts roasted over the fire, and edible roots and berries gathered from the surrounding wetland. Class as we understand it barely existed. but status did. Skilled toolmakers, respected hunters, and those entrusted with ritual objects like the deer headdresses likely held more influence within the group. There was no writing, but there was memory, oral history passed down with the same seriousness we might give a written record, teaching each new generation where the fish ran thickest, which plants healed wounds, and which parts of the marsh could swallow a careless foothold. If Star Carr had a landmark of communal gathering, it was the platform itself and the open water beside it, functioning much like a public square or harbor might in a later civilization. This was where fishing trips launched, where reeds were cut for thatching, where a dugout canoe, one of the earliest watercraft ever recovered in Britain, was likely built and paddled out across the lake. Evidence suggests this was not a one-time structure but a genuinely communal piece of infrastructure, maintained over years, a literal meeting point between land and water, work and gathering, practicality and pride. It would have been the closest thing the settlement had to a stage, a place where skill with a canoe or a fishing spear could be seen and respected by the whole community. Privilege, in the sense we usually mean it, wealth, palaces, private luxury, did not yet exist in the way it would in later, stratified societies. But even here, subtle inequality is visible in the archaeological record. Not everyone was buried, or laid to rest, or granted access to the deer headdresses and finely worked amber ornaments recovered from the site. Some individuals, it seems, held a kind of prestige unavailable to others, whether earned through skill, ritual role, or lineage. Even in a society built on shared survival, someone still occupied the closest thing this world had to an elevated position. And when the turning point came, as it always does, no one, however respected, however skilled, would be spared from it. That turning point was not a single violent night, but a slow, relentless shift in climate and landscape stretched across centuries. Beginning gradually and accelerating from roughly 11,000 years ago onward, the lake at Star Carr began to shrink. Rising temperatures after the last true cold snap of the Ice Age, a brief cooling period called the Younger Dryas, gave way to warmer, wetter conditions that slowly transformed open water into reed swamp, and reed swamp into encroaching woodland. Fish populations that had sustained the community for generations became harder to find. The platforms, once built to extend living space over water, increasingly sat above dry or overgrown ground. In the moment, families likely understood this the way people always understand slow change. Not as catastrophe but as inconvenience, a bad season, then another, then a pattern too consistent to ignore. Evidence suggests the site was used, abandoned, and reoccupied in phases across roughly 800 years, families adapting again and again, moving shorter distances, adjusting hunting grounds, before the settlement was finally left for good as the once productive lake vanished into fawn and forest. What followed was not destruction in the dramatic sense, but disappearance. The timber platforms sank slowly into waterlogged peat, an environment so low in oxygen that it preserved wood, antler, and bone almost perfectly for thousands of years instead of letting them rot away. Grasses grew over the site. Trees rose where open water had been. The people who once lived there scattered into other, smaller mobile groups as the climate and landscape kept shifting through the following millennia. Their story folded into the much longer, largely undocumented history of early Britain, unrecorded, unnamed, and for thousands of years entirely forgotten. Star Carr's rediscovery did not come until 1947, when peat cutting in the area exposed worked flints to a local amateur archaeologist. Full excavation began the following year, and what emerged stunned the archaeological world. The waterlogged peat had preserved organic material almost never found at sites this old anywhere in Europe. Wood, antler, bone, and plant matter instead of only stone tools. The deer skull headdresses were, and remain, unlike anything else recovered from this period in Britain. Later excavations in the 21st century pushed the timeline even earlier and revealed the platforms and possible house structure, confirming that people were building deliberate, semi-permanent architecture thousands of years before anyone expected it in this part of the world. Each find reshaped what historians believed hunter-gatherer life could look like. Not simple, not primitive, but resourceful, symbolic, and deeply organized. It is worth pausing on what all of this really means. Beneath a quiet field in Yorkshire lie the remains of real mornings, real meals, real grief, and real laughter, lived by people who loved their children and feared the coming winter just as much as anyone alive today. They were not a chapter in a textbook to themselves. They were simply home. Today, the site of Star Carr itself lies largely reburied and protected beneath farmland near the Vale of Pickering. The fragile organic remains too delicate for permanent open-air display, though ongoing conservation work continues to monitor and, where necessary, carefully excavate threatened areas. The deer skull headdresses, along with the amber pendants, worked antler tools, and the remarkable wooden platform timbers, are held and displayed at the Yorkshire Museum in York, where visitors can stand inches away from objects touched by human hands more than 11,000 years ago. A short distance from the original site, an on-site visitor center and reconstructed Mesolithic house allow people to step inside a full-scale recreation of the kind of dwelling that once stood beside the vanished lake, walking the same approximate ground where a community once launched canoes, split timber, and waited out the winter together. The lake itself is gone, replaced by gently rolling farmland, but beneath that ordinary-looking soil, decades of careful digging have proven that ordinary ground can still hold extraordinary memory. Thank you so much for spending this time with me and stepping back into a morning that happened 12,000 years ago. If there's a lost place, a forgotten civilization, or a single history-changing event you'd love to see brought back to life like this, drop it in the comments below. I genuinely read every suggestion. And if anything in this one struck you, a detail, a feeling, a question I didn't quite answer, let me know that too. I'll see you in the next one.